I'm going to introduce Jane, who has had a long career in education, teaching history and English, and then she became a vice president of California State University Channel Islands. Her degrees are in English, history, counseling, and education. Since leaving the university, she's written 3 books, the one featured today, which is the Boxcar Diplomacy. Jane lives at Lake Tahoe, where her family bought property in the 1920s.
I'm just going to give you a little bit of a framework for understanding this story. It is about 2 trains. The first train is called the Friendship Train, and they both trains follow World War II. The first one crossed America in 1947. The second one collected gifts from France in 1949. But really, the story of this friendship, you have to go back to World War I, which began in 1914. It ended in 1918. The Americans, as most readers of history know, entered very late. We didn't enter until 1917, but there were many French soldiers who remembered what America had done during that war and wanted to honor them. Now we come up just a couple of decades after the end of World War I to World War II. And of course, this man is the perpetrator of that war. And people remember World War II as beginning in September 1939 when Hitler and the Nazis invaded Poland. But I'm going to back up just 1 month to August 1939 when this man Hitler went to Joseph Stalin. And he said, let's make a pact. Let's make an agreement. It's called this German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And what he did was said, let's make an agreement not to fight each other for 10 years, for a period of 10 years. Now, this is really an agreement between oddfellows because the Nazis hated the communists, and the communists loathed the Nazis. Hitler hated Stalin, Stalin hated Hitler, but they both needed time. For his part, Hitler knew that he was going to begin his war to dominate the world in Poland, and he needed the Soviet Union to stay out of it. For his part, the USSR had been decimated in World War I, and he needed time to recover. So a month before hostilities started, Germany and the Soviet Union made an agreement. A month later, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And not only did Russia stay out of it, but they actually aided the Germans by keeping beacons on so that their tanks and pilots could navigate. It's called And Poland Fell Within a Month. And then from the autumn of 1939 until May of 1940, there was really not much happening on land in World War II. There was still a submarine war. But in Germany, they call it the Sitzkrieg, meaning the sitting war. In Anglo publications, they call it the phony war, between the fall of 1939 and spring of 1940, when Germany invaded the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as well as France. It took France in May of 1940 just 6 weeks to fall. And the terms of the peace, as you can see from this map, is that Germany was physically divided between the northern part, and you can see Paris up here. It's in the center of the northern part, which is occupied by Germany. In the southern part, it's called, in this map, it's called the Free Zone, but it's Vichy France, Vichy, because that is the center of this other zone that was essentially governed from Berlin. So you can see that France is physically divided, but it is also divided at this moment by allegiances. There was a strong resistance movement, and the de facto leader was de Gaulle, who was in England. The government, the Vichy government, was basically a collaborationist puppet government. And so they collaborated with the Nazis. So again, fast forward 5 years, and when VE Day happens in May of 1945, the guns have stopped, but the business of rebuilding a country that has been devastated physically and divided both psychologically and in every way begins. Then there's a 1-2 punch because the war ended in 1945. The winter of 1946-47 was devastating. There were spring floods, followed by summer drought. There was only enough milk in France to give to children 4 years and under. The crop yield in that summer of 1947 was lower than it had been since Napoleon's time, so over 100 years before. So the other thing that was happening is after World War II, two powers that would become superpowers were emerging. One was the USA under Harry Truman, and the other was USSR under Joseph Stalin. And these both leaders, this is the beginning really of the Cold War, because the United States represented democracy, the USSR represented communism. And both leaders, Truman and Stalin, knew that what was at stake here in France, and in fact, all of Europe, were the hearts and minds of people. And they also knew that they were starving, and they could be won by the people, whoever fed them. So here is George C. Marshall, who is the Secretary of State under Truman. And what he began in June of 1947, so it's the beginning of that terrible drought summer, he introduced the idea at a Harvard graduation speech in June, the idea of what would become the Marshall Plan. But it's billions of dollars of aid, and Congress had to approve this package. It was very contentious. What people often make the mistake of thinking, oh, during the war years, America was all one and we were all kind of on the same team. And that is true during the war. But then in 1945, after the war, which had brought full employment and the end of the Great Depression, after the war, there was the GNP, the gross national product, spiraled downward. There was massive unemployment. With the collapse of military spending, inflation ticked upward. There were so many labor strikes across the nation that the Republican Congress overrode Truman's veto and passed what would become the Labor Management Relations Act, essentially curbing workers' right to strike. So enter into this very divided country, and yet a winter coming up after the summer drought. The headline on this paper, which is dated October 1st, 1947, these people, this is Harry Truman in the middle, surrounded by cabinet members. And what Truman decided with the devastation of the summer crops, he knew that something had to be done right away. And he also knew that the Soviet Union was sending wheat in and getting a lot of publicity for it. So on October 1st, Truman went public with this idea, and it is called the Citizens Food Committee. And the man immediately to Truman's left, your right there, the young man, his name is Charles Luckman, and he headed up this committee, which was what Truman and his cabinet knew is that Europe would need 600 million bushels of grain, and the US had 500 million bushels of grain, but the rest would have to come from Americans by conserving. Now, they also knew from studies that what people were bringing home to their tables and also feeding to their farm animals, about 10% was being wasted. And so what Truman's Food Committee said is stop wasting, let's conserve. And so the slogan of the Citizens Food Committee was waste makes want, and want makes war. Now, what's important to know about this is that it was not a collection or distribution program. It was simply a conservation program. Um, and that and the idea was that the Americans themselves would make up the 100 million bushels of grain needed to feed Europe. But the tricky bit is this: Americans were already rationing. Some of you may remember, you were likely very, very young, but may remember there were not enough eggs. You didn't have meat all the time. And so people were already rationing, and now they're told, save some more because we need to send more to Europe. Now, enter into this scene this man. His name is Drew Pearson, and some of you may remember reading his column, which was widely syndicated throughout the United States in hundreds of papers. It was called The Washington Merry-Go-Round. And Drew Pearson is an interesting and complicated character. He was, as I said, a nationally syndicated columnist in hundreds of papers nationwide. He also had Sunday broadcast. He reached millions of people, but he's an interesting character because he's a prolific writer and a Washington insider. He's also a Quaker, so absolutely against war. But he's also worldly. He's lived in Europe, and his brother Leon actually at this moment in history lives in France. And so Leon knows, and they have a very close relationship. He tells his brother what's going on with the lines and the rationing and the limitations. The other thing that Pearson is a showman. He was criticized by fellow journalists because he sought headlines more than truth. As one critic said, he published cocktail gossip as if it were true. Now, he's an opinion columnist. He wasn't really considered a journalist, but he was one of the most popular columns of the time. And the other thing Pearson knew is that Americans were already sending food, some of it in small, like care packages. Again, some of you may remember your families putting together care packages. Some of it's large, like coming from governments and charities, but it is coming in quietly. And so what Pearson does is he comes up with an idea. He's read this column, he's read the news on October 1st, and he thought, this is an idea. This is a good idea that Americans can give, but he wanted more. He wanted a call to action, not to inaction. Conserving is kind of not doing something. He wanted a call to action. So on October 1st, he began working his network, contacting people in high places, charities, government representatives. And he said he had an idea of a friendship train. And you can see the headline of this column is "Europe Should Know Who Feeds It." And what he was saying, you can see it is written on October 10th. So from October 1st to the 10th, what he's put together is this network. And he does this column brilliantly because he doesn't sideline the government. He doesn't say that's a stupid idea. He writes this as an open letter to Charles Luckman, who is that man, the chair of the Citizens Food Committee. And he says, hey, good idea. This is a good idea, but it's not quite enough. And he floats the idea of a friendship train that would begin in California and end in New York. And golly gee whiz, maybe we can come up with a mile-long train. That would be 180 boxcars. And maybe we can fill it and send all of what we collect to France. Let's take the government out of the middle. Let's do it totally people to people. And in this column, he writes a very powerful story. He says that while the Soviet Union, on the day that a Soviet ship arrives in Marseille, the children are let out of school. There are parades in the street. Everybody goes down to the dock and waves Soviet flags. In the meantime, when an American ship arrives in Le Havre, all the way at the north of France, it's quiet. Nobody says anything. So what Pearson is saying, we're already doing this. Let's just show them. Now, this is audacious for a couple of reasons. One, it's October 10th. he doesn't yet have a train because in the United States, we don't have a national network of trains. You couldn't just make an agreement to go across the country. He needed to put together 5 different railroads to do this. But he floated this column to see what the response would be from Americans. And in fact, the response by Americans was grand. So he did another brilliant thing, which all organizers do, and that is you have an idea and you put a deadline on it. So he says, let's do it by Christmas. Now think of this timeline. He didn't yet have a train on October 10th, but on October 26th, he got a train. He got 6, actually, 6 different train lines to go across the country. And he decided he had organized a parade that would begin in Hollywood, California. And if it's one thing that Hollywood knows how to do well, it's do a party. So on Friday night, November 7th at 8 p.m., and again, look at this timeline. November 7th, the Citizens Food Committee had been launched October 1st. So 5 weeks later, 25,000 spectators watch as there's a grand send-off of 8 boxcars loaded with food that had been collected by Teamsters driving trucks throughout the Los Angeles area and through in the Central Valley, driving trucks to outlying towns, Boy Scouts, churches, civic organizations. The Screen Actors Guild themselves collected for a boxcar filled with macaroni. And Friday night in Hollywood, Klieg striped the sky. 150 floats went down the street in Hollywood. Word went out. Californians showed up in droves. American Legionnaires collected over 100-pound sacks of flour. Children in Bakersfield gave up ice cream money to join Kern County ranchers to buy a car full of wheat. Teamsters filled up, again, free of charge, just voluntary time. Teamsters picked up things from all over. Rolling out of Los Angeles on that night were 12 boxcars. 8 were filled with food, 4 were for dining, sleeping, and the final one was to accommodate a film crew. Because one of the brilliant things that Drew Pearson did is that he named as head of the publicity committee Harry M. Warner, who is one of the 4 Warner Brothers of Warner Brothers Studios. So on this train that would leave from Los Angeles, California, there was a film crew, and at each stop along the way, the crowds would be filmed. Drew Pearson knew that the food was important, but he knew more importantly that the message was much more important. He repeatedly said this could not happen in the Soviet Union. This is not government sponsored. In the Soviet Union, they're sending wheat, but they don't even know where it comes from. So what he did was he did newsreels. These newsreels were sent to France. And in a minute, you'll see a part of a newsreel. But before we get there, I'm going to show you a map that shows where the train began in Los Angeles, California, up through the Central Valley. And right here in that last slide, and I'm sorry I failed to identify him, that was the governor of the state of California, Earl Warren, who later became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But the train went from Los Angeles, California, up to Bakersfield, and Warren started a tradition that went across the country, and that is the governor or his representative went to the next stop. So Earl Warren went to Bakersfield, it went up through the Central Valley, into San Francisco, over to Sacramento. Vale Pittman, who was our governor, met the train in Sacramento. The planned route was across the country. You can see it goes across 11 states and then into New York. You can also see that there are many parts of the country that the train itself does not touch, but we will get to that. When the train got to Oakland, California, there's kind of an interesting story because Hawaii, which was not yet a country, or not yet, it wasn't a country, it was not yet a state, they wanted to contribute to the train as well. And CNH Sugar, you may or may not know that CNH stands for California and Hawaii. So the sugar from Hawaii always went to California. And so CNH said, okay, we will fill a boxcar with sugar, but the people of Hawaii said, no, this is not about big business or government. This is about people to people. And with an average donation of 8 cents, they raised $10,000 and ultimately sent 2 boxcars to Oakland, which joined the train. Again, the speed of this effort is just phenomenal because they got the trains in October 26th. It left Los Angeles on November 8th. It would get to its next stop, which is Reno, Nevada, on November 9th. Now, here is where our governor, Vale Pittman, got a little bit nervous because 27 boxcars were coming over from Sacramento. And he worried that Nevada would not even fill 1 boxcar. We're a much smaller state. And so he wrote a letter that was published in every paper in the state of Nevada. And he said, it is Nevada's obligation to contribute to the Friendship Train. Failure is unthinkable. It would place the great state of Nevada in a very bad light, which would reflect everlasting discredit. Each citizen, in responding to this patriotic and humanitarian call, will not only be helping to stave off starvation in Europe, but will also bring goodwill for this nation. So here's what Nevada did. 2 boxcars, 2 carloads of food to Vale Pittman's just delight. And I spend some time in the book. I can't in the course of this presentation say much about each of the collections, but I will say that what Nevada did was just remarkable. They, I'm going to read just a short piece here. The Nevadans did not want to be outdone by their glitzy, more populous neighbor to the west. Cub Scouts went door to door in Hawthorne and Babbitt. Senior Scouts packed food in Sparks. The fire chief from White Pine County drove a truck 400 miles to get his county's contribution to Reno in time to meet the train. In Yerington, the boys of Future Farmers America collected food from houses, businesses, and farmers, and school children gathered over a ton of canned and dried food, which was all boxed and labeled by the high school agriculture class. Farmers in Smith Valley donated 7 tons of wheat and barley. Residents of Henderson, Boulder City, North Las Vegas, and Overton collected 3 tons of food in several trucks, then kept driving hundreds of miles north and west to collect donations from Tonopah and Hawthorne. A truck from Ely drove 300 miles on the old Pony Express route and stopped at collection points in Eureka and Austin. The Lovelock State Highway Department drove 2 trucks with Pershing County's contribution, and 4 trucks from Elko made stops in Winnemucca, Battle Mountain, and Golconda. Reno firemen packaged donations from local schools, while students from UNR drove over 700 miles to haul wheat from remote ranches. So that's just a tribute to our great state of Nevada. And now I'm for about a minute, a little bit less than 2 minutes, I'm going to show a film that was taken while on the train in 1947.
It's a green light and a clear track for the Friendship Train as it rolls across the salt flats of Utah and roars over the endless trestles spanning Great Salt Lake. Mile after mile over America's Great West speeds the train that is our personal answer as a nation to the hungry of Europe. Through the snowbound rangeland of the cattle country, this mighty symbol of America's generosity rolls ever eastward. Everyone has helped. Railroads have hauled the train free. Unions have donated labor. Civic organizations have banded to fill the cars with the needed food. The spirit of 48 states is in this enterprise, and at every stop, enthusiastic crowds gather to hear Drew Pearson, originator of the Friendship Train. All have worked. The big people and the little folks have pooled their efforts to fill the cars. From whistle stops off the main line to the metropolitan centers, cars are loaded with food and more food. Flour, milk, Dried vegetables, dried fruit, canned vegetables, rice. These are the staples that pour into the friendship train night and day as it grows steadily, car by car, en route to the Atlantic seaboard. America's pioneers of the vast West once knew the meaning of hunger. Today, their descendants remember. Hundreds of thousands have joined in the mass effort, and the friendship train grows ever longer after each stop. It carries to Europe not an official government aid program, but the answer of a free people who have heard the cry of their neighbors in want. It is the free will offering by an America that wants to share.
So, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes,
Yeah. You can hear me now?
yes, I can.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that there's a little slice of a video that was taken, and remembering, or a film that was taken while on the train, and you can see those crowds. You can also this slide is of a train that comes up from Texas, because as I showed you on the map, not every part of the country was on the planned route, but every part of the country contributed. Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas got the Santa Fe Railroad on board. Already there were 5 railways, and by the time the train reached to New York, several others were enlisted by the people in that region, all for free. Stories about how the communities stepped up is inspiring. I did read that paragraph about Nevada because I'm proud of our state, but the contests in some countries, like in Ames, Iowa, the mayor put a thermometer in the center of the town to show they had a goal to raise money, and every day the thermometer would raise and raise until it exploded out the top. I don't have time to, of course, to go through very many places, but I am going to stop at one, and that is at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So this is a fascinating front page of the evening news from November 17th. And you can see the headline way above the fold: scenes at the depot where freedom and food trains meet. I don't know if you need to see that. Scenes at the depot where freedom and food trains meet. The Freedom Train was a train that was initiated by Truman's cabinet. And in 1947, what the cabinet felt, it was the very beginning of the Cold War. And these sides were beginning to solidify. What does democracy mean? What did we stand for in the war? So he started a train called the Freedom Train. And the Freedom Train carried the founding documents of our country, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation. The most recent was the Truman Doctrine, which pledged America's support of any nation that was combating communism. So these were the original documents. They were guarded by the Marines in every state of the Union, all 48 states. This train went and spent a week, and it was then called the Rededication Week. And during which there were events to talk about what is democracy, what does it mean. Attorney General at the time, Tom C. Clark, thought that Americans had begun taking the principles of liberty for granted. And he wrote that indoctrination in democracy is the essential catalytic agent needed to blend our various groups into one American family. Without it, we cannot sustain the continuity of our way of life. In its largest sense, preaching Americanism is an affirmative declaration of our faith in ourselves. So I chose this because America is actively pulling itself together. The government is saying this is what we stand for. So these two trains, so different in their missions, but they are both symbols of democracy. The friendship train was nourishment and encouragement to Europe. The message is, we have not forgotten you. We are your friends. And the freedom train, of course, was for Americans. While America was pulling itself together, France was pulling itself apart. The deadline on this newspaper is, again, that same week during which the friendship train is crossing America to huge crowds, and the freedom train is visiting every state. The friendship train is on the left side, friendship train crossing Iowa. But the big lead is the Reds, which was a euphemism for communists, lead riots in France and Italy. And the right-hand side, the big stories are about riots and death in Marseille, Naples, scenes of turmoil. In November in France, there were rolling strikes, civil unrest, communist agitation, dock strikes. Labor activists in Paris sabotaged a railroad and 16 people died. So even as Pearson is on this train making speeches at every stop about democracy, he knows that it's possible that all of these goods that people are putting on the train will never get to the people because there may be dock strikes in France. So they may say, we are not the workers. And again, back to why I introduced the notion of the Soviet German non-aggression pact, is that there were many, many communists in France. And after Hitler violated the Soviet German non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union with 3 million troops in June of 1940, the French communists were galvanized to fight Hitler, and the French communists really bolstered the resistance movement in France. So there are still many communists in France, and Pearson, and you have to see communists as anti-Nazi. So Pearson knew that there could be labor strikes, and he sent an advance man to Paris, someone who could make sure that the bounty of the friendship train would actually make it to where it was destined. And his advance man is called David Carr. David Carr, like Pearson, is a complicated character. And I'll get that back to him in a minute. But first, let's celebrate.
America's gesture of goodwill, the friendship train, speeds east through the world's greatest market basket, the Middle West. And the giving is lavish as the train halts at the great wheat centers of America's agricultural heart. Many a car swells the total as the friendship train rolls into Chicago. From an idea, the train has mushroomed into a project in which millions of eager hands are joined. Food becomes a refrain and a theme as thousands of tons pour into the cars destined for Italy and France. And always it's the youngsters who respond eagerly to the call. The last dash to the East Coast. At Pittsburgh, Mayor Lawrence greets Drew Pearson, the train's originator. Virtually all services, as well as the food, have been donated to make the friendship train the symbol of goodwill it is intended to be. And now, look at the mighty train as it rounds famed Horseshoe Curve in Pennsylvania. Railroads have hauled the train across the continent free of charge. So huge has the train become that during the last stages of the trip, its 214 cars are broken up into 5 sections, and it picks up speed for the final run. The train nears its goal as it rolls down the banks of the Hudson to New York, where the food will be transshipped to Europe. It's a race between America's great humanitarian effort and the bitter winter months just ahead overseas. The vast American nation has poured out its surplus, and New York looms at journey's end for the friendship train. Here is the traditional big town's welcome. Fireboats spray their salute in lower New York Harbor as 33 of the cars on floats are paraded past the Statue of Liberty, presented by France to the United States 60 years ago. Today, American food returns to France, America's answer to a call of distress.
The friendship train recall that Drew Pearson had hoped to get 180 boxcars. In that video, you could hear there were 214 on that train alone. But when you add the boxcars from the breadbasket states of Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Southwest, and the Northeast and the South, there were 700 boxcars that arrived in New York on November 18th. Remember that 25,000 people had sent off the boxcar in the 8 in Los Angeles, and estimated 250,000 people celebrated the arrival of the Friendship Train in New York. The Friendship Train had been like an avalanche going across the country. This is one of my favorite slides. It's a still of something you've seen in the video, but there is the one of the 33 boxcars in front of the Statue of Liberty. And the speed of this operation, just to emphasize that, the idea was floated on October 11th, and the trains were confirmed on October 26th. On November 18th, over 700 boxcars arrived in New York, ready to cross the ocean to get to France. Pearson had arranged for one ship to make it to France. In fact, 4 were required. And there's a kind of a neat poetic element that I'll talk about a little bit later. The first of the 4 ships left New York Harbor on December 7th, 1947. And it took 11 days to cross the ocean. And it arrived in Le Havre, which is in the north, 11 days later. And now we get back to the story of Drew Pearson's leg man, David Carr. He is, as I mentioned before, a fascinating character, but for this presentation, I'll just leave it at this. Carr had ties to the Communist Party. As a young man, he'd written for a penny a line for the Communist Daily Worker. And then he worked in Washington, D.C. for the Office of War Information. He'd been asked to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and then he was dismissed under a bit of a cloud and hired by Pearson. What David Carr did in France must remain a mystery, but what actually happened to the train is not a mystery. The train arrived in Le Havre, and here it is, Le Figaro, Paris, Thursday, December 18th. The train of friendship filled with over 500 boxcars happily has arrived in Le Havre. And it was utterly peaceful. There were no communist demonstrators. There were no speeches. And the dock workers, even as the speeches were given, by Pearson and others, dock workers in the background began to unload the ship. Much later, the communists would say that, there was nothing really in the American friendship. It was just filled with chewing gum and hair clips. But later, too, Pearson would write that the dock workers were given 1 ton of food for their families. But he said these communist sympathizers did not know that was coming at the time. So the train in Le Havre, all the ships were unloaded into trucks, and most of the goods were then sent by truck immediately to distribution points throughout. And at each of these points, there's crowds at every station. There was a ceremonial train that went from Le Havre to Paris, Dijon, Lyon, Valence, Avignon, and finally ending in Marseille. And this was just a ceremonial train because most of the goods went to distribution points. And at this point, this is one of my favorite slides, not because it's such a great slide, but because of this person right here. Her name is Gabrielle Griswold. She lives in Pennsylvania, and she was, and I have met with her many times, she was the secretary to this man, Robert Blake, who was the head of the American Aid to France organization. Gabrielle was just 20 years old at the time, and she was fluent in both languages, and she was charged with doing all of the secretarial duties of what would happen with this food once it got here. And just to spend a moment to even thinking about this very divided country, what Blake did brilliantly was bring together a lot of people and say, okay, we don't know how much it's going to be, how much food. We don't know what to do with it, but what should we do with it? So it was a collaborative effort that that he initiated. They decided this committee, which included all religions and many civic organizations, as well as the government. They decided that the bulk of the food would go to the children through the schools, and it would go to the schools as a goûter, which means to have to snack, or it's not a full meal, but it would stay at the schools. And the reason for this is that there was a robust black market. And in order to be sure that it got to the children, it would stay at the schools as an additional meal. So here again is another clipping. This is from Gabrielle's scrapbook, which she shared with me when I was visiting with her. And this says, Dijon acclaims the arrival of the train of friendship, a Christmas gift from the people of America to the people of France, a symbolic wagon, which will be followed by many others. So everything was going just very well, just as it should. Again, this is a publicity thing for both the United States and for the whole notion of democracy. On every truck, there's this poster that says, essentially, nourishment is provided spontaneously to the people of France by the people of America as a symbol of our caring. So again, this plan, which was hammered out by Catholics and Protestants and Red Cross and Untitled Chapter and the YMCA, everything was going just as planned until it wasn't. And that is on January 31st, 1948, communist arsonists burned the warehouse where 30,000 tons of food was stored. Now, the warehouse was used by several relief agencies in several countries. Entraide Français was an umbrella organization to which the Friendship Train contributed. And in fact, very little of the Friendship Train's bounty was in the warehouse at the time, because you recall there were actually 4 ships and most of the goods got on trucks to the distribution points. Nevertheless, this fire was devastating to the people of France and it did not help the communist cause, but it emphasizes this beginning of the Cold War when the two sides were trying to battle each other. And it backfired because this food aid could not be replaced. It didn't exist. There was not milk to replace the milk that had come from Finland and Norway and other countries. There was not the grain. There was not what they needed to replace. So what there was about 10% of the, actually about 20% of the Friendship Train's goods were lost. And what the committee got together to do is say, okay, what they had originally planned is about 10% of the total would go to the elderly, but they had to stop that and send it all just to the schools, because what was missing was the food that would have gone to the Paris area and the Seine. The logistics of distribution are just fascinating in themselves, but we're going to leave the Friendship Train at that. It did make it across the ocean. It did make it to the people. And this gets us to the second train, which is called the Merci Train. The official name of the train is Train de la Reconnaissance Française au Peuple Américain, but it is known really as the Merci, or thank you, or gratitude train. And it is linked to the Friendship Train by timing, because what the organizers wanted to do is exactly a year to the day after the friendship arrived, they wanted the friendship train to arrive in the United States. Logistics were a challenge, so it didn't arrive till early 1949. So there's that linkage, but there is also the linkage of a letter written by two veterans who were in head of a veterans group that were also railway workers. And they wrote, France must respond to the friendship train with a gift that is worthy of France and is also worthy of those who twice in a quarter century shed blood for liberating and safeguarding France's brilliance. And that, and along with the contents of the friendship train, is why I began with World War I. This was a thank you. Yes, thank you for this gesture of friendship, but the food really was a gesture. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for what you did in World War I and II. Now, each state, unlike the friendship train, which just disgorged the food and only the food crossed the ocean, 49, what this veterans group located were 49 boxcars. Those of you who have been to the train museum have seen our Nevada boxcar. And they look like this. They are, they're called 40 and 8s, and you can see the number emblazoned here because it held 40 men or 8 horses. This is a photograph of one that I took in New Mexico. I could get a better picture of that because it's outside, although ours is now better cared for. Ours used to be outside, but it's now inside and not wearing so much. But they found these 40 and 8s, refurbished them. And again, this connects this friendship to the wars because our veterans would have remembered riding in them to the fronts. Right now, in 2021, 44 of the boxcars have been preserved. Each of the boxcars held about 1,000, 1,200 gifts. And I'll get to the gifts in a minute, but first I'm going to get to the arrival of these boxcars in America. Here is the ship that carried them. And I love this picture because it provokes a couple of stories. In a reverse of what happened to Drew Pearson, who had arranged for one ship to take the goods to France, and in the end he needed 4 ships. What the organizers of the Merci Train did was they arranged 4 ships, and then they found this ship. It's called the Magellan, and it was built by the Germans to use in World War II. But it wasn't finished when the war ended. It was huge. It is huge. And so all 49 boxcars could fit in this one ship. Those of you who are historians will know that in 1949, we didn't have 49 states, we had 48, but the organizers of the Gratitude Train wanted to acknowledge Hawaii's contribution and also send one to Washington, D.C. So Hawaii and Washington shared the 49th. Now, here's another story that I love about this, because those of you who are sailors at all know that the speed of your craft has something to do with waterline length. And this was a huge boat, so it went very fast. And it arrived 2 days before the ship that was following it, which was filled with the dignitaries. Now, when I was in France, I was able to talk to Christian Huart, who was the son of Georges Huart, who was actually on this ship that we are looking at. And he wrote in his journal, and the transcript also survives, that when this Merci America ship got off the coast of New York, the other ship wrote to them and said, just lie a hull, stay off, wait for us. We'll meet you in 2 days. And of course, these letters are 10 feet high. Merci America, you could not miss it. And the captain of the ship said, oop, sorry, too late. There's no laying low now. So the ship came into the harbor, and 2 days later, the dignitaries arrived. And of course, the celebrations did wait for the dignitaries, who are here in the Waldorf Astoria. And on this day, the actual boxcars, when they arrived, were offloaded, and they immediately began to proceed across the country to their various points, because each state got a boxcar. One of the first stops was in Washington, D.C. It's a wonderful story because they actually carried the perpetual flame from the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in France to our Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. The boxcars were brought to every state. Here is our train arriving in Nevada. And when I was made one presentation in Reno, I don't know if any of you know Michael O'Shaughnessy, but he remembered that day, though he was but a boy. And what was in the train, what was in the boxcar was, it was up to each governor to decide what to do with what the gifts that were given. And what our governor decided to do was to give the gifts away. So, for example, the Nevada State Museum has a wonderful collection, but most of the books went to in the archives, and you can see there's some Jules Verne books that are in our Nevada archives. Some of the art went to museums, toys went to orphanages. So they were really, most of the gifts that went to Nevada were dispersed. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the gifts were in kind of big swaths, because, obviously 52,000 gifts, that's a lot of gifts, but they're big themes. And one theme is war. This is war memorabilia. These are helmets from World War I. And the reason I chose this piece of trench art, there was a lot of trench art as gifts. And again, hooking this thank you, not just to the friendship train, but to what you did for us in the war. The reason I chose this vase, it's not a particularly elegant one, but it did come with this note from the person who sent it. And the note basically said it is from Madame Georges Tarine, whose husband made this during the Battle of the Somme in 1918. There's a lot of World War II memorabilia. And again, some of the things are, here's a Washington. Some of the things recall our long friendship. France was our first ally as a nation. This painting, it's a large painting. It's commemorating the German surrender at Rheims in the schoolhouse. But France also wanted us to remember they're known for other things. And so they had the big fashion houses build these are each models. They're 2.5 foot tall models. I took a picture of this from the archives in New York from a book. But they made 49 models, and they covered the each dress is in period costume, and they covered the period from really about 1733 to 1906. It was planned that there would be one model in each boxcar, but when they all got to New York, it was decided that it would be better if the collection stayed together. So all 49 models are in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. They are not currently on display. At the right, you see a woman in a wedding dress. Each car had a wedding dress. Nevada's wedding dress is in the Textile Museum. A few states had contests about who would be able to wear this wedding dress. And the rules of the contest varied. Sometimes they had to be marrying a veteran. But one of the main rules was that the bride had to fit this dress. And the dresses are all in what today's sizes would be anywhere from 0 to 2. There were also some valuable works of art. The Winged Victory of Samothrace is actually it's a replica, and it's in Boise, Idaho. And this is the statue that got me asking questions, because I was in Idaho presenting another book that I had written called Sons at War. And I was visiting the state capitol, and up in the Capitol Rotunda, I saw this and I thought, well, what is this doing here? The original, many of you may know, is on the top of the grand staircase in the Louvre. But right next to this is a card explaining that this came on the Merci Train. And I thought, what in the world is the Merci Train? The middle sculpture is Benjamin Franklin. That's appropriately in Philadelphia. It's by the famous sculptor Houdin. The Pierre Tavot statue of Washington is in George Washington, on the George Washington University campus in Washington. This painting is not by anyone famous. It's of a person called Bertha Neuflard, but it kind of indicates there's paintings and many beautiful things that came across. People wanted to say thank you in many ways. And each of the boxcars held a Sèvres vase, which Sèvres, France is known for its porcelain, and the president of France, President Auriol, gave a vase to each state. But most of the gifts, most of the gifts were things like this. These are all from the Nevada State Collection, and they're simple items. A piggy bank. The toy soldiers that you see here were given by a 10-year-old boy to a 10-year-old boy in Nevada, and they actually had a correspondence. And the Nevada State History Museum has been in touch with both boys. They never met in person, but they did meet in a video, which was kind of fun. There's painted items and this beaded, a lot of textiles, this beaded cap. The middle one is a doll, and there were thousands of dolls. And the reason for this is probably that Eleanor Roosevelt was our delegate to the United Nations at the time, and she was in Paris. And she suggested that dolls be sent to American children. In the lower left, you'll see 2 Renault cars. And I put these in there because every boxcar had a set of toy cars. Renault needed, after the war, needed to have an image rebuild because during the war, they were in Vichy France, and Hitler wanted to move the Renault factory to Germany, and Renault resisted doing that and said, no, let's keep it here. When the war ended and Germany lost, many said that they had been collaborationists, and in fact, they had built 30,000 tanks for the Germans. What Renault said is we sabotaged many of those tanks, and importantly, we kept 12,000 jobs in France. Nevertheless, he lost his life prior to being able to be, prior to his day in court, because there was so many divided feelings in the country at the time. I'm going to end my presentation with just 3 more in-depth stories. Well, I guess 4 more in-depth stories about individual items. And these are all well, 3 of them are in the Nevada State Museum. This first is a watercolor, and it's in the archives in our museum. And when I saw it, it really took my breath away because the colors are as vibrant as the day it was painted. It's a grave site for James R. McConnell, who left the University of Virginia in 1915 to become one of the first Americans to fly for France. He died in a dogfight over this field in Flavy-le-Martel, and a friend, Lucien Cahan Michel, who later became famous, but he painted this picture for his friend, and he then sent it in a boxcar in thanks, and it arrived in Nevada. McConnell's remains were later moved to the monument of the Lafayette Escadrille, and he too became famous on the campus at the University of Virginia because there's a statue of a winged angel called the Aviator. And that sculpture was done by Gutzon Borglum, who also did Mount Rushmore, and not incidentally, our own John Mackey at UNR. This next one is one of my favorites, and it is a Limoges candy dish. You can see that it is chipped, and there's also tape on it that won't be removed so that it won't be damaged. But it was given, the note that came with it, it was given by Madame Bouthier. On June 15th, 1944, American flying fortresses bombed her village of Angoulême. And the Americans were aiming for the German occupied railroad station, which was an artery back and forth to Germany, but they missed. And instead they destroyed 400 homes, including Madame Bouthier's. Her note says none of that. You would not know that what had happened on June 15th, 1944 in her note. Her note only tells us that she's 64 years old and she's a disaster victim, but she couldn't let the train go without sending her gratitude. She was sorry that the dish was chipped, but she had lost everything in the bombing and this is the best she had. If my means were as great as my gratitude, my gift to you would be much bigger. This next one, the second to the last one, is one of many, many pictures done by children, school children. It's clearly a school assignment. The Nebraska State Museum has and you can see them online, has many pictures done by children. I chose this one because I particularly like the cuffs of the two children reaching across. And geographically, they've made some effort to make it geographically accurate as these ships cross the ocean. The very last slide of the day is this one. It's a simple but beautiful brass teapot. It's been on display here at the Nevada State Museum, along with the note that accompanied it. And the note is written on a very small business card of Alfred Nahon, who is a plumber. He's from Nimes, and his note said he is grateful to America for delivering him on May 1st, 1945 from Dachau.